I dislike Sadhguru a little bit because he says some silly things. How much ego still exists in Sadhguru? I would think non-trivial amount. I mean, in my estimation, more than Adi Shanti, for example.
So,
But
what's your take on people having like gurus? Some people look up to sadhguru.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another brand new Enlightenment podcast. Today we are joined with Leo Armad and Artem Boytsov. Nice to meet you both. And Artem is our special guest here today. We have many topics to discuss. So without further ado, Artem, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Thank you, my friends. I'm doing wonderful. I hope you're doing well too. Thanks for having me.
Yes, and Leo, how about yourself?
Yeah, doing well. Excited for this round 2, and looking forward to see how it all pans out.
Yes, so we had brief discussions beforehand on what topics we want to discuss today, but I'm curious if Artem has any ideas where we should start. Take it away.
As we briefly discussed over text, I think the topic of spiritual abuse, the topic of, I wouldn't say fraudulent, because very few spiritual teachers are 100% fraudulent. Very few. Most have made some realizations, but I would say immature. Let's just call it immature. The topic of immature teachers is an important topic, and how much damage they can do. And I think Leo has mentioned when we were talking in private that he has gone through some quite traumatic experience with a spiritual teacher. So I was wondering that maybe it would be a good start for our conversation if Leo shared his story, and then we can discuss signs, kind of how to differentiate what is a role, what is a true role of a spiritual teacher, and kind of things like that. There could be lots of interesting, important discussions.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I think how this originated was like after our first conversation, there was like this realization that I think there was this perspective that I can be perceived as a narcissist or someone that can be very attacking to certain spiritual teachers. And I think a lot of the roots of that had come from my own experience of teachers in the past when I was in my seeking years. And so like now when I come into contact with certain people, it can bring up a lot of, you could say, aggression, or like maybe there's a wound that's present. And so I bring a level of attacking energy. And so yeah, like I'm happy to give context and speak about that.
Yeah, I'd love to hear.
I think one of the core things I shared with you in the previous call was like how much money I'd spent seeking and like the different teachers. And yeah, up to now it's been over $200,000, around $220,000. It's kind of funny to look back at now, but there's a lot of compassion I hold for myself simultaneously. Yeah, I mean, I was suffering for many years. Like, I started off when I was 21. It started with physical health issues. And so I had this really big ego when I was like 19, 20, and I was really taking advantage of people. It's kind of like karma had like hit itself back to me. And then, yeah, 21 physical health issues. I was pretty much in a pitch black room for like 6 to 7 months. I lost my ability to walk. I was losing balance. I was in a pitch black room pretty much all day because I was sensitive to noise and light. And so I went from like a really high up. I was, making a lot of money and living a lavish lifestyle to losing everything. And so, yeah, I spent many days just crying in my room and praying and asking for guidance. And slowly but surely, I started to come into contact with spirituality, and I connected with different spiritual teachers. The first teacher that I connected with, I started working with him, and he was actually great for me. But I ended up getting sucked into his vortex. I spent about 30 grand working with him for a year, and he would do a few calls with me every single month, and he would guide me through my awakening process. And yeah, thereafter, like the suffering had started to intensify. She got diagnosed with, say again?
As it usually does.
As it usually does. And I thought I was in a dark night of the soul, and so like typically at the end of a dark night of the soul, it's like it gets better. But for whatever reason, every single year was getting worse and worse and worse. I was like, what the hell is going on? I can't even fathom living like this. But yeah, eventually I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. This like 1 year after, and then I started doing psychedelics, and I had a very intense mushroom ceremony, ayahuasca ceremonies, and I started getting these like entity attacks. And so after that, I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and so there was like this like madness that I was experiencing day in and day out. I'd go from rage to joy to sadness to, it was like permanent swing of emotions to the point where I couldn't even hold a conversation with anyone. And yeah, so I pretty much stayed in my room all day, every day for another 9 months. I couldn't leave the house, crying all day. And but every time I would come into contact with certain like spiritual teachers that would say they could help me or they could do something for me. So again, spent money with living with a shaman, about 20 grand for like 3 weeks. I lived with another guy for like 4 days, spent another 20 grand with him. Nothing was really doing.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah, it was a lot of money.
Wow,
And then the worst, which was it was like right at the end. This is right before the big shift in awareness. I spent 100 grand for 1 year to work with 2 coaches, and this was like towards the end of it, they started to become quite manipulative to keep me sucked into it, and hey, keep investing money, keep staying along with it. And I was suffering deeply. Like there was no, like I didn't really have my own personal, like I was living off of a wound. And so it's like they were kind of like feeding into that wound. But yeah, anyways, October 29th, I had that big shift in awareness, the dissolution of a personal self, and then all the seeking ended. And so I was like, what the like what was I doing? This is ridiculous.
Congratulations.
And thank you. And same with the suffering and all the mental health issues, they kind of just like start to dissolve slowly but surely thereafter. But with that, like after that big awakening, there was a rage in me, an unprocessed rage that was like, yo, I need to get back at these people, and I need to like shed light on all the stupid, psychedelic teachers and all the spiritual masters and all the gurus, and I was just throwing rocks at everyone, and I was on a mission to destroy them all. And so hopefully that gives context as to why I bring a certain level of
It's understandable. Completely understandable.
And yeah, that's pretty much that I want to share in this moment.
Well, thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for sharing it in detail. So if you don't mind, I'd like to speak a little bit. Let me remember. I made a few mental notes. Let me run through them. Yeah. So just to tell you a little bit about my experience, my own experience with teachers and seekers, so to speak. So I'm actually a very kind of unusual spiritual teacher, I would say, because most of my students are not seekers. I actually have
Most of your students are what, sorry?
are not seekers. I'm not even sure that I have seekers. I mean, of course, quite a lot of them, most of them are suffering. Otherwise, they wouldn't be my students. There are some people quite deep on the path where the suffering is very significantly reduced. Some fellow teachers in the community also, but most of them have at least had the moment of realization or an awakening experience or in the state of abiding awareness. So what you refer to as what you refer to as the end of seeking. So the end of seeking is not the end of suffering. The end of seeking is not the end of the ego, as you know from your own experience. But it is a tremendous relief. Even though sometimes suffering comes up in extreme ways, even after the end of seeking. But at the very least, after the end of seeking, you kind of know that there's there's the light at the end of the tunnel, so you know that it's temporary, so it's not as difficult as it can be before, where you're pretty much going blind. So quite a lot of my students come from the background of very different spiritual teachers, and I also attract a lot of people who want to be teachers on my forum. So I have been exposed to all sorts of tricks and manipulations and whatever is left of the ego, how it manifests itself in a person who wants to be a spiritual teacher. The ancient saying that if you desire to be a spiritual teacher, if you really want to be a spiritual teacher, if you would suffer if you were not a spiritual teacher, then you're not qualified to be one, is actually correct. But this represents such a deep stage of realization that if we applied this standard to everyone in the spiritual marketplace, almost no one would be left. So, well, except like very mature teachers like Adyashanti, so, but kind of the overall spiritual marketplace is unfortunately a very dangerous place, because it has a lot of people with insight. Some insight is quite mature, but strictly speaking, it's always a combination of insight and ego, and whatever is left of the ego tends to corrupt in certain way the relationship with the students. So I'm all too aware about everything that is going on. I wanted to mention that the period of deep instability, just in the interest of the listeners that are listening, to comment on your story, that the period of deep instability, extreme swings of emotions, and periods of extreme suffering is very normal on the spiritual path, unfortunately. Unfortunately, also, if you're working with an immature teacher, then they might even blame you for that, or they might blame you for the suffering or unease that it brings into their life. I've even had a female student whose long-term teacher, also a female, I think, became suicidal at one point, and also, by the way, becoming suicidal, or at least witnessing some suicide ideation, is all but universal on the spiritual path. Like, most people have some amount of, because the ego does not exist, but it's a creation of the mind, and the ego wants to go away. It never lived. It wants to die. It's just that it is confused in the way that it's confusing itself with the body, and so kind of when the ego desperately wants to go away, to be, which it can't. It can only be dissolved in love, dissolved in self-love, dissolved in the love of awareness, accepted, hugged, and dissolved. But it wants to go away. So the thoughts, and sometimes intrusive and repetitive thoughts about suicide, are actually quite common. That's actually why people commit suicide. If you consider, then most people do not commit suicide out of physical pain or some sort of unbearable circumstances in life. Most people commit suicide out of emotional pain and suffering. And the interesting thing that survivors also tell, that, for example, I read a beautiful articles about people who jump off Golden Gate Bridge and survived, and it didn't surprise me at all. Like, the very first thought that ran through his head as he jumped was, everything could be fixed except what he just did. So that's actually very sad. So that's the main reason that the ego commits suicide. So the ego wants to go away, but in its confusion, it thinks that the only way is to kill the body, basically. But coming back to my point, so suicidal ideation comes up very, very frequently in the spiritual path. And in this particular case, the teacher blamed the student for their suicidal ideation. So like, you have driven me to thoughts about suicide. So just to give an example of how early people start teaching on the spiritual path, like without having really dealt with the significant portion of the suffering of the ego to such an extent that they can blame their own students for the most natural thing that the ego does. The interesting and we can talk about, and maybe we should after this, we can talk about the different signs of good and bad spiritual teachers, so kind of how to choose one, what to look for, red flags. So we can talk about all of this in detail. The interesting dynamic that I would like to mention here. Hold on, I've already forgotten. Wait a second. The interesting dynamic that I want to mention here is, even though attacking immature or fraudulent, or however you may call them, judgmentally or non-judgmentally, teachers can be fun, and I did it too, and it took me quite some time to make my peace with how fucked up the spiritual marketplace actually is. It was actually one of the most, in some ways, it was even more difficult. In some ways, it was even more difficult than accepting my parents completely for how they are. Because you see, a spiritual teacher is in some way more than a parent, because a parent rarely gives you unconditional love, even though they're supposed to. But a spiritual teacher is basically advertising unconditional love and using the language of unconditional love. All of this exalted language. I do this to you because I love you. I had you have no idea how many times it was told to me in one way or the other, right, as a justification of a behavior, or my abuse is for your own good. So it's actually, to me, it was one of the most difficult things to forgive. The people who position themselves as the champions of unconditional love engage in abusing behavior and using the language of unconditional love to justify. So it was quite difficult for me to forgive. Forgiving happens on the emotional level. So you forgive when you no longer feel bad about it, right? So for as long as you want to like rage about it, for as long as you're bitter about it, for as long as you cry about it, and it all comes together. It's always anger and then tears. It's two sides of the same coin. The grief and the rage are always two sides of the same coin. And so for as long as it happens, the forgiveness process continues. And I guess a point that a more kind of concise point that I wanted to make is that forgiveness of the fucked upness of the spiritual marketplace, in my own experience, was one of the longest forgivenesses, one of the longest process of forgiveness that I underwent. And so, of course, during it also, I wanted to challenge and I wanted to rage and be angry. And I'm not dissuading you from that. For sure, it can be therapeutic in a way, unless you kind of disturb work of people whose work shouldn't be disturbed because they're doing good. But it can be therapeutic. It can be cathartic to express all of your discontent about the mistreatment that you have been subjected to. But the interesting thing that I have realized close to the end, and a sad thing, is that it takes two to tango.
Yes,
It takes two
absolutely.
to tango. So all the students of those immature teachers, they very rarely can be, well, safe, so to speak, like basically persuaded to change their students, to change their teacher. If they can be, it means that they have already been long suspected. So, like, for example, in my own story, I've engaged in a number of conflict with some teachers, and even though some of them were public, at least for the audience of the teacher, for their sangha, at most like 2 or 3 people from the sangha would come to me and you said you're right. I've been suspecting it for a long time. That's not healthy. What's going on there? And came to me. So it actually quite rarely happens because people play out their unconscious patterns, and in some way, in my teachings, how Ramana said there is no other. So there is no psychological other. All the psychological other is in the mind. So you could say that you're angry at them for taking advantage of you in this way, but you could also say that you're angry at yourself for letting them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So this dynamic is unfortunately very much present, and
you could say the anger is almost a projection on some level as well, because really you're really just angry at a physical form, but it's almost like a reflection of who you are in a way, or your repressed version of self, perhaps.
Yeah, and just. And you're also angry at your own actions, right? Because you voluntarily, it's not like, it's a different situation when you're taken in physical slavery, but you voluntarily acted towards them.
That's the thing. So you can't even really blame anyone. At the end of the day, it's just like it was all orchestrated for a reason, and I think that's kind of where I did arrive as well. It's like,
exactly.
What happened?
Which doesn't mean that elucidating and helping others to choose the right teacher is not a worthy pursuit, right? And I have written along this. I remember. I think that I sent you some links, and I have written about this also quite extensively, because if you're a seeker, it's just a labyrinth. Like if you're a seeker, it is so difficult because you see. The ego seeks to emulate. The ego seeks to find an idol and what's the word that I was gonna an ideal person. Like that is the kind of person that I would like to be. You see, and so with a spiritual teacher, with a position of spiritual teacher, it can be very dangerous for 2 reasons. Because first, spiritual teachers oftentimes exude this level of confidence and impenetrability, which can be true strength, but it can also be the remaining narcissistic core of the ego. So it could be both. But in any way, something that is very attractive for the, like, oh, I want to be strong like that. I want to be impenetrable like that. And then they oftentimes enjoys the position of respect and love, right? So it's a double whammy, right? Oh, I want to be like that. I want to be strong and like don't give a fuck like that. And then when I'm like that, then also everyone will love me and respect me just like they love and respect him.
So what's your take on people having like gurus? Some people look up to sadhguru and other gurus, and they say that this is like the idol, the person that they're meant to be like. What's your take on that?
I think that a good guru, a good master, will eventually attempt to destroy this view in their students of themselves. So it's not like this view cannot be useful. So, like for example, Osho once said, "I lure you with love, and then I start hitting your ego." So it's not like that. This view may not be useful to some extent, to a very limited extent, to form a sincere, genuine relationship with a teacher. But I think a good teacher, at least with someone who you work with personally, will start to slowly pick at that view, because the role of a good teacher is not to be an ideal for you, is not even to be an inspiration for you, but in a way to be a gateway for you. So I oftentimes say in my own practice, in my own talks, that the only measure of a good teacher, and that's really the only measure, is how consistently and effectively they help you to see or realize something about yourself that you were in denial of before, that you did not want to see before, that you have forgotten before, that you have rejected before. That's the only measure of a good teacher. Everything else is not a measure. So for as long as a teacher is doing that, they are helping you, right? And it does not require kind of the God level adoration. Sometimes it happens, sometimes people, for example, have one student that calls me Bhagwan, and I say, don't call me Bhagwan. I'm just a guy like you. And he says, please allow me. It just makes me feel better. And I say, well, okay, but we both know. And he said, well, yeah, but it just, I'm just kind of feeling, I feel better when I do it. I feel that it's appropriate. So only have one person like that. But so any sort of pedestalization, when you look at it in this framework, right? So the teacher is a tool. The teacher is your tool, literally, right? It's not someone to adore, emulate, become like. Like the goal of the teacher is to help you become like you, not like them, but to help you become the most you can be. That's the goal. That's their role, right? And so when you look at this from this framework, then of course pedestalization is not necessary. I mean, of course some respect is granted, but you can say this about anything, right? You go to any like university, computer science, math, like anything that people study, and then where there are some more mature, experienced individuals that share knowledge, of course some level of respect is appropriate. But pedestalization, no, it's not. It's not needed at all. It's about the student. It's not about the teacher. It's never about the teacher. It's always about the student, about helping them to make progress.
I feel like pedestalization is like a level of manipulation as well. It's like you're trying to influence and persuade that person. Well, it's like a form of people pleasing in a way. I mean,
Yes,
how would you?
if the teacher actively engages it and encourages it, then yes. But it oftentimes happens without it, because there are some people who are kind of prone to it. Like for example, so basically, the more here's an interesting thing to think about it. So the ego is our inner child, right? Is our inner struggling, hurting child. I think you and probably many of your viewers have heard this characterization before. I love it because it's very humane, it's very real, it's very touching, and it's also very much uh, reflecting of what the ego needs, which is love, unconditional love. And the journey is about you learning to give unconditional love to yourself. The teacher, from that perspective, is a conduit. So you can kind of feel how it feels like to be unconditional love, but the job is still for you to learn to love yourself in this way. So the ego is let's say a child, and which is also reflected in religions, because if you look at the figure of God in a lot of religions, that's pretty much an abusive father or a benevolent father in some other religions, but it's always some sort of a father figure. And so the more kind of wounded, ungrown, immature, yearning for love and acceptance the ego is, so the more it has been rejected to a person when he was a little child, the more the tendency will be to to look at the teacher as a kind of a parental or godlike figure, and that's completely normal. The only thing that's important is that the teacher does not abuse it. I remember in some talks of Adyashanti I watched that he said, that people tend to look at me as a kind of a godlike figure, and at first I used to fight with it, and now I don't. And he left, and I completely understand why, right? So the most important thing is not to abuse it. The most important thing is not to take advantage of it, because it's the most precious. It's the most precious relationship. It's basically it is this rare kind of relationship where a person that have never been shown true unconditional love, and you cannot be a seeker if you have been if there's been an abundance of unconditional love in your life. If you're seeking enlightenment, it means you've been deprived. It means you've been deprived of love. So it's the most precious relationship uh, when a person like that has access to, of course, very partial. The teacher has many students, and of course, it's not the same as living with someone or having a truly loving parent. But still, some access to being unconditionally accepted is the most precious and profound relationship. So abusing this relationship for your own gain is the most profound betrayal. So ultimately, the role of a teacher is to transfer the same love to you so that you love yourself in the same way. And then you no longer need the teacher. So in any teaching, there's a moment when you, after absorbing this and learning to love yourself in a much better way, you need to distance yourself. And good teachers also start pushing people away a little bit when they feel like they can stand on their own feet.
Yeah. It's like one of the things I said to Shiva in a recent call was like the concept of becoming your own mother, becoming your own father, becoming your own lover, and just like returning back to absolute sovereignty. And when you're in that space, it's like you don't actually need to grasp onto anything, really. It's like the love that you have is right here. You take care of yourself.
That's precisely right. Yes. And from that perspective, the teacher is only an image, kind of what, only a representation of what this love can be, but it's not a replacement for your own love. Yes.
What do you think about Sadhguru as a teacher?
To be honest, I'm not very much familiar with Sadhguru as a teacher. I dislike Sadhguru a little bit because he says some silly things, like, for example, like, he once say things uh, like only yogis who are trained can hold on to their bodies in enlightenment, which is basically a suggestion that there's a very real risk of physical death in enlightenment, and there's some technique to hold on to your body until you, otherwise you will die. That's actually not true. Enlightenment is our birthright, so everyone kind of can get enlightened. And he says other similar things. So in my mind, he's a mystic. So does Sadhguru have a deep degree of realization? Undoubtedly, he is self-realized. Undoubtedly, how much ego still exists in Sadhguru? I would think non-trivial amount. I mean, in my estimation, less than in Adyashanti, or more than in Adyashanti, for example. But we also have to make this caveat that all of this is conjecture. It's easy to look at videos and analyze, and okay, here you said the wrong thing, and here you kind of didn't answer the questions very well, and here you evaded, or blah blah blah. But in truth, the living physical presence, there is no greater test. So if you feel different in the living physical presence of any teacher, it means that their ability to love supersedes yours. and there is at least something to learn from them. So on on the level of impact to humanity, for example, Sadhguru is one of the best teachers of our time, because just look at his impact. Look at how many people he inspired to be on the path. How many people have he helped? Not only like with his meditation, but also with his talks, with kind of the display of lightness and wisdom that he does. So you can have like a super duper like clear teacher with like zero ego and 5 students, or you can have a teacher who is has not transcended the human suffering, the psychological suffering completely, but has massive impact. So from that perspective, to disrespect someone like Sadhguru would be silly. It's he's a real figure. Would I prefer other teachers? Would I recommend other teachers over Sadhguru? Most definitely. I would recommend teachers with a little bit less spiritual woo-woo, with a little bit kind of more uh, uh, direct direct to heart manner of speech. So Adyashanti being one example, that kind of don't make outlandish statements. So there's some things that I would criticize about Sadhguru, and my exposure to Sadhguru is very, very small. So I'm sure that if I spend my time on viewing, reading, watching Sadhguru, I would find many new things to criticize, as well as many new things that I would like, and I would say, "This is great. This is brilliant. This is very good."
Understood.
How do we discern between expression of ego versus expression of enlightenment? Because
Oof, good
it
question.
can look very similar on the outside.
Exactly. Perfect question. Amazing question. Very difficult. Extraordinarily difficult. Because you see, here's the interesting, uh, underappreciated and mind-boggling thing about reality. Every action, almost every action, uh, maybe you can find some examples, but those are very rare. Almost every action, observed action that you can see, I can come up with a situation, with a circumstance, for which this could be coming out of good intent, and then I can come up with a situation or circumstance for which it could be coming out of bad intent.
So you
So,
said good intent versus bad intent? Is that what you
yeah,
said?
yeah, like so um, almost every action, if taken in isolation, right? If you don't know the whole picture, the whole context, the whole circumstance, almost every action could be in one context coming out of goodwill, and in another context the same action, but in another context could be coming out of bad will. So strictly speaking, uh, uh, when you're just looking on the outside, unless something is really obvious, it can be very hard to say if the action is out of goodwill or ill will. The absolutely defining test is the inner state of consciousness of a teacher. So the actions that are coming out of ill will, that are propelled by ill will, are propelled by pain. So they are driven by the discomfort in the teacher's own conscious experience. So all sorts of defilements, as they call it. I mean, the terminology doesn't really matter. But like, for example, anger, fear, jealousy, bitterness, all of those are different forms of pain. And if the action is to, if it's driven by the pain, is the action is to relieve the pain of the teacher, or it's a response to the pain of the teacher, then it's driven by ill will, it's ill intent. Unfortunately, you don't have access, you don't have direct access to the conscious experience of a teacher. They can lie about it, or they can also be unaware, especially mature teachers. They can also be unaware. They can be very emotionally / energetically suppressed, and they can be unaware that the actions may seem automatic to them, and they may say, oh, it's the universe, just, there is no doer. There is no doer, it's just things just happen. The universe moves me, right? But in reality, if you look deeper, if they meditate deeper, there's some pain that they're not in contact with, that is driving this as a painful response. So uh, so of course we can make some very obvious things, right? So if the teacher constantly, if the teacher does temper tantrums, screams at you, abuses you, touches you physically, this is a huge no, right? If you have not touched the teacher, if you're not a physical threat to the teacher should never put hands on you ever. So of course, we can make some situations that are very obvious. So kind of obvious displays of rage, aggression, like hitting, screaming. I mean, this is very obvious. But for most people, even kind of just a very honest conversation, especially when it's accusatory, and people love to accuse. I mean, the ego constantly accuses the judges, right? Can get very emotionally uncomfortable without any obvious signs of aggression on the level of kind of very apparent emotional display. And there could be very deep similarity and confusion between narcissists and enlightened teachers, especially for people who have their own narcissistic traits. So let me expand on this, because the similarity is only on the surface. But the depth is very different. So the similarity comes from two main directions, so to say. The first one is that they cannot be affected by you. That is actually the scariest thing for the ego, because the ego exists in emotional relationship, and the ego is used to manipulate other people with pulling on the emotional springs. So the only person who cannot be emotionally affected by you, for an average person, the only people they will ever meet that they would not be able to emotionally affect would be sociopaths and psychopaths. So that can get spooky, just talking to a person whom you cannot influence. And another similarity that is also on the surface is the feeling of being manipulated. And again, I mean, if you are talking with a good teacher, they will try to minimize. They will try to be as sincere as possible. They will try to explain what's going on. They will try to minimize this, but it cannot be completely eradicated, because strictly speaking, if we look at what it is, feeling manipulated means that that the other person, that the person that you're dealing with, knows what's going on and you don't. And so when you're dealing with a narcissist who has a secret hidden agenda, but they will not reveal your agenda to you, but unconsciously you understand that there's something another person isn't telling you. You see? So that is the foundation of the feeling of I'm being manipulated. So when you're working with a spiritual teacher, most of the time you won't have it if they're honest, sincere, because they will sincerely and honestly open your questions. But when you're struggling a little bit, oh, sorry, not a little bit, but when you're struggling, especially when you're deeply struggling, they still, it's the same dynamic, because they understand what you're going through, because they have gone through something similar, and you don't yet understand what is happening to you. And so this kind of feeling of being manipulated is also on the surface similar. That's why it can be easily confused. But now the deep, profound difference is, of course, beyond the surface similarity. As it oftentimes happens, when you look at the extremes, they often appear similar. All black canvas and all white canvas is similar in some way. so something very similar happens here, because on the deep level, they could not be more different, because narcissists, sociopaths, they have their own agenda and they manipulate you for their own gain, right? And so they want something from you. A true teacher wants you to make the realization. They want you to be happy. They don't want anything from you. So if you don't, so they don't have a reason to pursue you, manipulate you. Like, for example, if they say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I feel like it's not working out," or just stop contacting them, they're not going to manipulate. If they pursue you, they're not going to try to bring you back. They are independent from you. That's why they're scary, but also that's how you can test, because someone who has an agenda and who wants something from you, they fake independence, but in reality, they do want something from you, and you can actually see what you want if you are what they want if you're observant and you wait. So, what is driving a real, true spiritual teacher is the joy, the pleasure of leading you towards your own happiness, and nothing else. But if you don't give them this privilege, they're not going to try to make you. Their freedom, your freedom to them is the highest value. If you do not want to be their student, they're not trying to make you. Narcissists or sociopaths, they don't even have your freedom as value. They don't value you at all. Of course, there are obvious things like manipulative tricks, like gaslighting, insults out of the blue, like things like that. But we're not talking about this. We're talking about, most narcissists are smarter than that, and of course, spiritual teachers with narcissistic traits are also smarter than that. That's very obvious. But if you feel like there's something off, if you feel like there's that it might hurt, but there's some deep truth, there's something in there, there's some deep truth, authenticity, something that you're attracted to, even though it hurts. It's like love. So when you fall in love with a woman, or a woman with a man, it can be very scary, it can be uncomfortable, it can be painful at times, but you're drawn. You're like authentically, you authentically drawn. You feel it's right. So it's similar with the teacher. If it feels right, that even if it's uncomfortable or hurt, or like you get anxious when you speak to them or something like this, I would say get over it, develop this relationship. But if it feels really off, if it feels like that is not right, you may even feel like some part of your old conditioning, maybe you've been abused before and that feels familiar. You see? So, but on some level, you understand that that's not exactly right. That something is off. That I would say, find another teacher. Of course, we're talking about personal relationship with a teacher, because there are many teachers who uh, are not very good at kind of teaching in a very personal, intimate way, or maybe that's not even something that they do a lot. But they have wonderful meditations, wonderful talks. It's not mutually exclusive.
Do you think it's possible to go beyond the ego? And has anybody ever done that? Have no ego whatsoever?
I do. I think it depends on how you define ego. Of course, if you define ego as the body, then it's not possible. It's death. But it's also the most useless definition that you can come up with, because in this definition, like, there is no enlightenment. There's just, it's all, what is it about? But if you define ego as a psychological character that finds itself in a mutually codependent, painful relationships with other psychological characters, suffers and does not feel free, does not feel that they can do whatever they want in this life, but feels that they're obliged to live a life how they were taught, for example. And then I think so. I mean, it's absolutely true in my experience, and it's only a question of the degree to which a person is free from ego. And we can say, we can make statements like, the ego never goes away, it's an infinite path, and there is some truth to that. But we can also, practically speaking, look at the situation as, if you have been living your life, and for the last year, for example, it's been wonderful, beautiful, extremely satisfying, content. You do not suffer psychologically. You do not experience any anger, resentment, bitterness, grief. The sights are beautiful. You love the people in your life, and you look back, and there's been no suffering in your life for X amount of time. Then you can say, well, practically speaking, at this point, you living without the ego. It's not a statement about the future. All statements about the future cannot be proven, so it does not mean that you will not suffer again. But again, practically speaking, just like, by the way, Leo also mentioned, the suffering tends to be that tends to be the highest, most intense form of suffering around the spiritual awakening, before or afterwards. And then it kind of starts to diminish. So you can look at the suffering as a sort of an asymptote, as a sort of a graph that approaches zero but never hits it. And of course, if we're looking from a perspective of the person in the separated state, a seeker whose suffering was at 1, then anyone who's suffering at 0.01 pretty much doesn't suffer at all from their perspective. And so even though you can make a claim that, maybe it's not possible to completely eradicate the suffering, and I'm talking about psychological suffering, physical pain still exists. From practical perspective of somebody who is a seeker, of course, practically speaking, it's pretty much it. And there are some people who suffer so little psychologically, or don't suffer at all, that I would say from practical perspective, they don't have any ego. Does this
Understood.
make sense?
Yes. Where do we go from here?
I still have time. I still have about half an hour. So
I actually have a meeting coming up soon.
I think it was a wonderful conversation.
Yes, likewise. And we hope to have you again on sometime soon.
I would love to. I would love to. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Bye.
It was great talking to you guys.